Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having me here. It's a distinct honor to be here at the Central European Academy conference today. We've gathered here to discuss a question that touches the very heart of our legal and political existence. The theme of this forum asks whether international and European Union law are merely frameworks for cooperation, or whether they have become vehicles for intervention. Do they shape state sovereignty, or do they disrupt it? As we look across Europe today, from Warsaw to Budapest, from Rome to Berlin, we see that this tension between national autonomy and supranational influence is no longer just a theoretical debate for law professors. It is a lived reality. It is a source of political friction, and it's a challenge to that every constitutional court in Europe must face. Today, I would like to offer you the German perspective on this tension. There is often a misunderstanding, I think, about Germany. There's a perception that Germany is the model pupil of integration, a state that has dissolved its sovereignty entirely into the European project. But in my view, this view is incomplete. If we look closely at the architecture of the German legal system, we do not find a state that has abandoned itself. Instead, we find a complex structure which we call open statehood. This concept, open statehood, is the central thesis of my presentation today. The German constitution explicitly opens the state to the international community. It encourages cooperation. It mandates integration. However, and this is the crucial point I wish to stress today, it opens the door, but it also installs a heavy, immovable doorframe. It allows international law to enter, but only on specific terms, and only within specific limits defined by the German constitution itself. Over the next 15 minutes, I will guide you through this architecture of open statehood. We will examine the constitutional foundations. We will look at the unique status of the European Union, of course. And most importantly, we will discuss the powerful emergency brakes the Federal Constitutional Court has installed to protect the constitutional identity of the state. So let us begin with the foundation. How does the German legal order relate to the world outside? The German basic law does not treat international law as a single monolithic entity. Instead, it adopts a differentiated approach. It distinguishes between three things: general international law, international treaties, and the special order of the European Union. First, let us look at general international law. This refers to the customary rules that bind all states, such as the prohibition of aggressive war. Here, the German system is very open. Our constitution states that these general rules are an integral part of the federal law. They enter our legal system automatically. They do not require a parliament to vote on them. They simply are. Furthermore, the Constitution assigns them a very high rank. They sit above our ordinary federal statutes. This means that every German judge, every police officer, every administrative official is directly bound by these general rules. In this specific area, the German state consciously subordinates its ordinary legislative power to the consensus of the international community. However, the picture changes completely when we look at the second pillar, international treaties. When it comes to written agreements between states, whether trade deals or defense pacts, Germany switches to a strict dualist model. Our constitution makes it clear. The signature of the government is not enough. For a treaty to have legal effect within Germany, the German parliament must pass a specific law approving it. We call this a consent act. This is not just a formality, it's a fundamental expression of democratic sovereignty. It ensures the executive branch cannot bind the citizens to international obligations without the approval of their elected representatives. Once this consent act is passed, the treaty enters the German legal order. But here lies a critical nuance. It enters with the rank of normal federal law. It does not stand above the parliament, it stands equal to it. This has a profound theoretical consequence. Under the standard rule of legal interpretation, a later law overrides an earlier law. So theoretically, this means the German parliament could pass a new law today that explicitly violates a treaty ratified yesterday. We call this a treaty override. While our constitutional court mandates that judges should always try to interpret international law in a way that avoids conflict, the hard sovereignty of the parliament remains. The legislature cannot bind itself forever. Thus, regarding treaties, the German system prioritizes the current democratic will over international obligation. This brings us to the third and most complex pillar of our architecture, the European Union. The European Union does not fit neatly into the categories of international law or national law. It is something unique. To accommodate this, the German constitution has a specific provision, Article 23, often called the Europe Article. Article 24 commits Germany to participate in the European Union. It allows us to transfer sovereign powers to Brussels. But based on this article, the German Constitutional Court has developed a concept that is essential for understanding our position. The EU is a so-called association of sovereign states. The court insists that the EU is not a federal state, it's not the United States of Europe, it remains an association of sovereign nations. The member states are the masters of the treaties. The EU only has the authority that we, the states, that we, the peoples, have lent to it. So how does EU law apply in Germany? We apply EU law not because the European Court of Justice claims supremacy. We apply it because the German Constitution commands us to do so. The German Parliament passes a law that acts as a bridge. It instructs all German courts to treat EU law as if it were superior. This results in the famous primacy of EU law. If a German national regulation conflicts with a European regulation, the German rule is pushed aside. However, and this is the key to the German approach, this primacy is granted by the German Constitution. And because it is granted by the Constitution, it can be theoretically revoked by the Constitution. The validity of EU law in Germany ultimately rests on the authority of the German Basic Law. This theoretical construction is not just an academic game. It is a real consequence, and it has real consequences. It means that the opening of the German state is not unconditional. The Federal Constitutional Court has developed a doctrine of constitutional identity. It argues that there are certain core structures of the German state that are so fundamental they can never be abandoned, never be transferred, and never be violated. To enforce this, the court has established three distinct review mechanisms. Three shields that serve as emergency brakes against the overreach of European power. The first shield is the fundamental rights review. This is the oldest mechanism. In the 1970s, the German court told the European authorities, as long as the European community does not have a catalogue of human rights that is equivalent to ours, we will review every piece of European legislation. This was, of course, a direct challenge to the absolute supremacy of European Union law. It forced the European level to take human rights seriously. Today, the German court has stepped back. It says, as long as the EU maintains a high standard, we will not exercise our jurisdiction. But, and this is vital, of course, the court has never surrendered this power. It holds it as a reserve. It's a shield hanging on the wall, ready to be taken down if the standard of liberty in Europe should ever collapse. The second shield is the ultra-virus review. This mechanism is all about power and democracy. The principle is simple. The EU only has the powers that the member states have explicitly given to it in the treaties. If an EU institution, whether the Commission, Central Bank, or even the European Court of Justice, acts significantly beyond these powers, it's acting ultra-virus, beyond its strength. The German Constitutional Court argues that if an EU act manifests a structural violation of competencies, it lacks democratic legitimacy. The German people consented to transfer specific powers, not unlimited powers. The consequence is severe. If the German court declares an EU act to be ultra-virus, that act is legally non-existent in Germany. German authorities are constitutionally prohibited from applying it. So this is a hard border of democracy. The third and most powerful shield is the identity control. This is the ultimate barrier. Our constitution contains an eternity clause. It states that certain principles can never be abandoned and amended. These principles are human dignity, the core of democracy, the rule of law, and the federal structure. The Constitutional Court has ruled that because the German parliament cannot abolish these principles, it certainly cannot authorize the European Union to violate them. You cannot transfer a power you do not possess. Therefore, the court reserves the right to review any EU act to see if it touches this inviolable core. Unlike the other reviews, this is an absolute limit. The identity of the Constitution is non-negotiable. Now, you might ask, is this just theory, or does the court actually bite? So, for many decades, critics argued that these shields were merely decorative. They said the German court was like a dog that barked but never bit. But that narrative changed fundamentally on May 5th, 2020. In the landmark judgment known as PSPP concerning the European Central Bank, the German Federal Constitutional Court proved that its doctrine has sharp teeth. For the first time in its history, the German court declared a judgment of the European Court of Justice to be ultra-virus. The conflict arose because the European Court had approved the central bank's actions with a very lenient review. The German judges argued that the European Court had failed to properly apply the principle of proportionality. By failing to check the economic effects of the policy, the European Court had, in the eyes of the German judges, stopped doing law and started doing politics instead. So the German judgment used clear language. It called the decision of the European Court objectively arbitrary and methodologically untenable. By declaring the European judgment ultra-virus, the German court detached the German legal order from the European ruling. It stated that the European judgment had no binding force in Germany. This was a moment of profound constitutional tension. It laid bare the reality of the European legal order. It is not a hierarchy where Luxembourg sits at the top and commands the nations. It is a network where the ultimate source of legitimacy remains the national constitution. Distinguished colleagues, this approach is not without its critics. Some argue that if every national court states and decides which EU laws it likes and which it dislikes, the uniform application of European law will collapse. However, from German perspective, this tension is necessary. It is a mechanism of checks and balances. In a federal state, you have a Supreme Court that settles conflicts. But the EU is not a federal state. It lacks a single sovereign. Therefore, the conflict between the EU claim to supremacy and a national claim to identity and democracy cannot be resolved by hierarchy. It can only be resolved by cooperation and occasionally by conflict and tension. A German constitutional court envisions this relationship not as a chain of command, but as a crisis mechanism. The threat of an ultra-virus review on the ultra-virus declaration serves as a warning signal to the European institutions. It reminds them that their power is borrowed, not inherent. So let me conclude. To return to the question posed by this forum, is law a vehicle for intervention or a framework for cooperation? German answer is, it is a framework for cooperation, but only as long as it respects the constitutional identity of the state. The architecture of open statehood is a sophisticated attempt to reconcile two competing necessities of the 21st century: the need for deep international integration and the need for democratic self-determination. Germany has chosen a path that is neither isolationist nor federalist. We have not built a wall against the world, but we have not dissolved our statehood either. We treat international law with great respect. We treat European Union law with primacy. But we have placed the ultimate fuse box in the hands of the Federal Constitutional Court. This architecture ensures that European integration remains a democratic process. It ensures that the transfer of power is always legally controlled and legally limited. Germany remains a cooperative state, but it is a vigilant one. We open our doors willingly, but we reserve the sovereign right to close them when the fundamental principles of our democracy are at stake. Thank you very much for your attention.